introductions, my name is Lucy Munamo, and welcome to our 7 Ways ColdFusion project team. I'd first like to start by introducing Michael Smith. Michael Smith is the founder and the CEO of TerraTech. He's presented over 50 conferences and user groups. He's written over 200 articles on ColdFusion. He started the CF United Conference and ran the Maryland ColdFusion Users Group for many years. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Lucy, and welcome everyone to the webinar. And let's just quickly go over what we're going to be covering today. We're going to first look at what a project is, and then look at 7 ways that ColdFusion projects fail, including scope creep, buggy peopleware, lack of user executive support, poor planning, lack of vision, incompetent staff, not that any of those will be on this webinar, I hope, poor testing and deployment. And then also we're going to have Q&A. And if you have any questions while we're going through the presentation, feel free to bring those up. We'll either, if they seem relevant to the section, we'll interrupt, or we'll bring them up in the Q&A at the end. So let's start. Just to let you know that I've been doing programming for a long time now, over 37 years, and been doing ColdFusion since version 1.5 about 16 years ago. And I founded TerraTech in 1989, and we're the ColdFusion paramedics and specialists. So let's look at what a project is. A project has a beginning, an end, and it takes resources. So if you're just working on some code and it goes on forever and it never has an end, that is not a project. But if you have something that has a delivery date and has some requirements, and you can tell when you're done, and it takes up resources, then you have a project. And also, projects typically have some planning and visualization, a whole bunch of implementation where you develop, test, and deploy your project, and then I usually make sure a project has a clear close, and we learn what lessons we can from how the project went well and what we can improve. So if you have a project, why would you know it's successful? It's successful if you meet the expectations of your stakeholders. So that, to me, is the key. What is their perception of what you've achieved? So let's have a look at the first thing here, which is scope creep and requirements. And some of the issues that I've seen in scope, in this area in scope creep, are the scope just changes during the project. You start off with one set of requirements, and then you discover other ones as you're going. And related to that is that often users find it difficult to express in a way that developers can understand what their needs are. And obviously, if the scope has increased, that leads to late delivery of the project, budget overruns, stress, late nights spent coding when you'd rather be doing other things. And all those endless changes to the code base often will reduce code quality, particularly if it's done under pressure. Writing code is a very brain-intensive task, and when people are stressed out, their code quality tends to go down. So what can we do about these issues and other issues to do with requirements? So I think one of the most important things is having clear written requirements. And that's not just writing, it also is screenshots or mock-ups of any screens and reports that you have in the system, because users often can't fully understand a written set of requirements, but they can, when they see a picture of something, understand that it is or isn't what they exactly want. And then related to that, I think it's important that those requirements, once they've been developed with your users and executives, that they get signed off, and that we're going to stick with this until we deliver version 1.0. And then if there are any changes that come up, have some kind of way of tracking that in a formal change request system. That could be a spreadsheet, it could be a system that you buy or make yourself. But the important point is that you track the changes and you evaluate, okay, are we going to do these in the next version, or are we going to adjust our schedule to get them done in this version? So those are the some of the solutions on there, and maybe it's time to see what kind of issues you all have out there. So do you have a poll ready, Lucy?
Yes, Sure, I'll go ahead and start the first 4 questions. What issues do you see on your ColdFusion project? I'll give you about a minute or so to respond to this. Scope creep, people issues, poor planning and project management, incompetent staff, poor testing, and deployment practices. 1, 2, 3.
So what are the results we see from the poll?
Okay, so the results that we see, scope creep is at 89%, people issues at 56%, poor planning and project management 44%, incompetent staff 17%, poor testing and deployment practices 61%. So it looks like scope creep is the biggest issue most people see.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me because I've seen that on a lot of projects, and we certainly have a lot of systems in place at TerraTech to keep control of that. So, and it's also interesting that people issues are pretty big. So I guess getting along with all the other developers, and team members, and users can be a bit of a issue as well. Great, well thanks for that. So let's move on to the next topic here, which is buggy peopleware, and seeing as that was the second biggest issue people have. And for those of you who haven't read the book Peopleware by Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister, which I highly recommend checking out, peopleware is the political and social issues in software development, which often get a back seat to technical issues, but unfortunately often are the key to why projects fail. So some of the things that come up in this category are low developer productivity, where not much good quality code gets written, maybe poor teamwork where people aren't working together well, or actively disrupting the project. I've seen projects where it seems someone's role on the project is purely there to cause trouble. And then bad group dynamics where things just don't gel, and you can't get what you want from the users that are involved, or other things of that nature. So this has been studied for about 15 or 20 years, and but it's not so widely known. So here are some of the solutions that I found, and Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister have found have helped on this. And just in case you've never heard of peopleware, it's actually a very popular book in Microsoft, and they use it for a lot of their successful teams. So one of the first things is to make sure you hire smart people for your team, and then having hired smart people, you trust them and don't micromanage them, and trust them to make the right decisions on the project given the vision and the parameters for it. And then a second, maybe surprising thing, given how many open plan offices there are that people work in, is it really helps when you're programming to have a private office and have windows, because programming takes a lot of thinking, and often if you're working on a complex piece of code, it takes 15 or 20 minutes to get your head around where it is and really get into the flow of writing that code. And then if you get interrupted, it takes another 15 minutes to get back into the flow after the interrupt has gone away. So private office helps you in keeping interruptions down, and also being able to turn your phone off if you're in the middle of a coding spree helps as well. So and part of this is not having a Dilbert style boss. You need someone who is a manager who's going to protect you from senior executives or corporate politics that might get in the way of you getting productive work done, rather than interfering and micromanaging with what you're doing. And just generally, company policies can either support good code or they can totally get in the way of it. So having someone higher up in the organization protect the programming and project team from that kind of thing can be very helpful. So those are the peopleware things. I'm curious what issues people have where they are. Do we have another poll?
Yes, Michael, I'll go ahead and pop the next question. So the next question is, what peopleware issues do you have? Select one or more of the following. No private office with door and windows, too many interruptions to get into programming flow, corporate politics, bad hiring practices, or any other issues you might have. Again, I'll give you a few seconds. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it looks like too many interruptions to get into programming flow has 68%. No private office with joined windows is 55%. Corporate politics, 45%. Bad hiring practices, 18, and other issues, 14.
Well, that's quite surprising. Nearly 2/3 of people get too many interruptions to get stuff done. And, you know, that kind of explains why so many people do a lot of their work by coming into the office early, working from home, or staying late after hours when the number of interruptions goes down. So those are all kind of workarounds for it, but really if you can set up the environment where you don't get the interruptions in the first place, that would be even better. Because really in ColdFusion projects, it's not how many hours you put in, it's how much good code you get written. So that's my belief anyway. Anyway, let's move on to the next category, which is related to that lack of user or executive support. So why is that an issue on a project? Well, firstly, if you're working on a project and you can't get decisions made, or they do get made, but they get made at the end of the project after you've already coded your application a totally different way, that really can screw up deadlines and how long things take. Another issue I've seen is where the two departments have some kind of argument over whether you're going to get data or not, and no one higher up will bang their heads together to get the issue resolved. And then another thing that maybe is less obvious, if you don't get users involved in your project, then you end up with shelfware, which means that you wrote some great code, the operation was a success, but the patient died on the table because none of the users want to use the application and it's left on the shelf like Cinderella. So what can we do about this to do it? So I think one of the key things is to get early buy-in of a senior executive and have them as a project champion. So they're not formally on the project team, but they're there to support it, and they support the vision, and if anything has to get dealt with on the political level or getting different departments to work together, they're there to support the project. And also I think it helps to involve users in the early stage of a project in prototyping, doing user interface reviews to get their feedback. Some people even go as far as videotaping or users using the prototype to see where they get confused, how many clicks they do, all that kind of thing, and then altering the application to make it easier to use. You might at a later stage do some kind of A/B test where you have two versions of your site and then see how people respond to that and what the click-through rates are to adjust things. And then also, generally, in my experience, people don't like to change, and that includes users. Users don't like change. They don't like new processes. They don't like new software. So you've got to kind of have some psychology or motivation as to why they would want to change. Why do they want to use this new version of this app, and what's in it for them? And if you can answer the what's in it for them, they're far more likely to want to use the application or the site for it. So let's move on to the next item, which is poor planning and lack of milestones. So some of the things, if you don't do good planning, that happen there is that maybe you have people on the project, but they're also working on other projects. And just when you need them, they're busy on something else. Or maybe they're off on vacation just at the deployment time when you thought they were going to be there. So if you don't keep track of who's going to be working on what when, all kinds of issues can come up there. The other thing
let me ask a polling question, because just before you go on, I'm curious to see what planning is done on top projects. So I'm going to go ahead and do a poll. Okay, so what planning is done on your project? It's, you can answer this: detailed task list, task estimate, risk analysis, resource allocation planning, dependency tracking. Okay, again, 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's interesting. Task estimate.
So it looked like
79% detailed task list, 63%, and then the rest.
So that's interesting. Most people are doing task estimates, which is certainly a change from a few years ago when I asked the same question. But very few people doing risk analysis or looking at dependencies. A fair number of people are looking at resource allocation, or a quarter of people are anyway. So that is great. So let me just say what the final issue I saw on the poor planning is lack of milestones and versioning. So having release versions, instead of like the ongoing death march project that you never know you're done, it's much better to have split it up into smaller chunks and release them and make sure they work okay, and then move on to the next version. So what are some of the solutions on poor planning and milestones in a ColdFusion project? Well, one of them is the task list, and it's not just having a task list, but is it a good task list? And part of it being good is not having any black hole tasks that, you know, you've got weeks of time allocated to them in your estimate, because the chances are there's some confusion in there or extra complexity, and they're just going to take longer than you thought they would. Second thing is making estimates, which I'm glad to see most people on the call today are doing, and making accurate estimates for those tasks. And that's much easier when the tasks split down into small pieces that you understand. Also, keeping track, even if it's in a spreadsheet or on a whiteboard or something, of like who are all the resources, what are they doing, and then using some kind of project management software, whether that's something like Microsoft Project or Basecamp or one of the other many other project management softwares out there to keep track of all this stuff. So let's move on to our fifth point, which is lack of vision and objectives. So you might ask, well, why is that important? Because if we don't know where we're going, how are we going to know if we've arrived at the project conclusion? And another issue that can occur if there isn't a clear vision or a set of objectives that are written down and shared is that some team members may go off in different directions. And I've certainly seen that on projects where one person thinks the project should be achieving one thing and someone else thinks it should be achieving another, and the users think it should be achieving a third thing, and surprise, surprise, no one ends up being happy at the end of it. So what are the solutions to vision? Well, clearly having a written vision up front, and that doesn't have to be very long. It can just be a few sentences saying, hey, here's where we're going to be when the project is complete. And also I would give some business reasons for why the project exists and what the value is, because that helps remind you when you're thinking of creating some fancy feature, is like this supporting the business case for this application, or is it just something that's technically interesting but isn't really going in the direction of the vision? And then you might list some goals as to, perhaps how fast the application runs, or what kind of sign-up percentage you get, or other things. And you might want to make those SMART goals, in other words, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. And then another very important thing related to this is to list out any assumptions you've made, about the environment. Maybe you're assuming you're running on ColdFusion 9 against MySQL, or maybe you're running against Oracle, or maybe you have an assumption that some other piece of code is dealing with authentication, or perhaps you have an assumption that your users have some realistic test data that they're going to give you by a certain date. So listing out those things and making sure everyone on the team understands them is definitely very helpful. So that's vision and objectives. Let's move on to the sixth issue after having a look at what are the other benefits of project vision are. So having a vision helps you get a common understanding of the project, and also helps keep things in scope. When you're having some discussion or maybe an argument with users over what the scope is, having a written vision that you can refer back to helps it clarify, okay, are we really in scope here, or is this like a new thing? And also one other thing I didn't mention earlier is that a vision often helps people get enthusiastic, helps get them started, and see past obstacles and resolve issues. So let's move on to item 6, which I know 17% of you said happens on your project, incompetent staff. Unfortunately, not everyone programs as well as everyone else. And in fact, in studies that have been done, there's actually a 10-to-1 variance between the worst programmer and the best programmer. In fact, I think some of the worst programmers actually act in a negative way because they introduce more bugs than they actually produce good code. And as well as this being a technical issue of the quality of the project and how fast things get done, it tends to demoralize other people if there are incompetent staff on the project. And it also relates to increased turnover costs. And by that I mean that if you have to bring a new person into the project to replace someone else, you've got all the learning curve and training time that not only takes that developer, but also all the people who have to help him or her out in getting up to speed. Because generally on larger projects, there's a lot of time spent communicating between team members. So every time you change team members in and out, it's going to add to your costs there, let alone any hiring costs you have on bringing new team members in. So what can we do about this issue? So I think the key here is to have good hiring practices for developers. And that may not be the same as the hiring practices you use for hiring other kinds of people in the organization. And for me at TerraTech, that generally involves having a practical test, because it doesn't matter how great someone's resume is or how great they can talk at an interview. If they can't write good code under a deadline, they're not going to do so well on the kind of projects we have. So I think looking at how you can practically tell someone's a good developer and they work well with other people, and that they have good integrity and do what they say when they say they were going to do it, are all good things to look out for. Related to that, and this is typically true in large organizations, is someone may try and give you staff that you really don't want on your project. So if possible, keep them off your team, or if for political reasons you got stuck with them, at least don't put them on key tasks. Give them some task that isn't going to affect other developers so much, maybe. I don't like saying there are things that aren't so important in a project, because all things matter in the end, but if they're doing something like documentation, at least it isn't going to screw up the code quality of other people. And then if you put a good team together, it makes sense to keep the team together for future projects rather than splitting them up to the four corners of the organization and then just hoping you're going to get another great team together. So generally it takes a while for people to work well together and to understand their work habits. So if you can stay together for another project, that makes sense. So let's go to the seventh and final item on this webinar, which is poor testing and deployment, which I know a lot of people in the pre-webinar registration questions had issues with this. So here are some of the issues I've come across over the years. Firstly, too many bugs showing up in production. Obviously, even one bug in production is one too many from the user's point of view. But I've seen systems where bugs are showing up every day in production. Another thing can be that the application worked fine when it was only had a few hundred records in the database, but now it's got hundreds of thousands of records in there. It's not running at all well, and pages are taking minutes to run. I worked the other day with a client, and they wrote some code that really wasn't ideal, and it was taking 20 minutes to run with the data volume that they had for the report they had, which was just unacceptable for their users. We tweaked it and got it down to 5 seconds. So, but that's a common issue I see in projects. And then related to that is that the server crashes under load when a lot of users connect to the system that haven't been tested for. So what can we do?
So, Michael,
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. So I'm going to ask like a question that is for database issues, and then there'll be another question about testing, so one of the poll questions. So what database issues do you have? Here's the question. What database issues do you have? Select one. Complex SQL code. You can select one or more, sorry. Complex SQL code, slow queries, schema changes, take too much time to code, error handling, hacking protection, and security concerns. One, two, three. Okay. Go ahead.
So that's interesting because often database issues are behind a lot of these deployment issues because the database wasn't planned out well to start with or wasn't tested with correct data volumes. And interesting that pretty evenly spread between slow queries, complex SQL, poor error handling, or security concerns. So seems like half the people involved in this webinar have issues with their database. So, thanks for that poll, Lucy.
Okay.
So let me go over the solutions to this, and then maybe we can see what other people have issues in testing and deployment. So here are some of the potential solutions for testing and deployment. First of all, it makes sense to me that you have a formal acceptance testing period where you spend a couple of weeks or maybe a month, depending on the size of the project, where you've finished development, you haven't deployed it to that version to live yet, but you're going through your test plan and beta testers are trying it out and you're fixing any issues that come up rather than just throwing the code into live straight away. As well as doing testing on the code, I find having other developers review the code and looking for issues is actually much quicker at finding issues, bugs, and poor pieces of code than testing. So then also I'm surprised how many people don't have a staging server, which is, as well as having a development server where you develop the code and a production server where the users access the code, you have a third server where you do testing and you make sure everything in that version is okay before pushing it to production. And you might be doing load testing on there. And ideally the staging server is a pretty accurate mirror in terms of hardware and software of the production server. So same version of ColdFusion, same version of the database, similar data quantities, similar type of machine if possible. Another thing that can help, particularly if you have a clustered environment, is to have automated deployment scripts that automatically copy new code out of your Subversion or Git or whatever you're using for change control and deploy them out to all the different servers in the cluster. And the same thing with any database changes, deploy those into how many database servers you have in your cluster. And then also making sure your servers are tuned correctly for the volume of data and users you expect, I find is important for successful deployment. And for me, a successful deployment is one that is stress-free and goes smoothly and everything just works fine. An unsuccessful deployment is where there are constant bugs, things aren't working, and there's confusion with different versions of code being overwritten by mistake. And well, let me not go into all the terrible things that could happen in that, but suffice to say I've seen some pretty bad deployments over the years. So you had another poll, I believe, Lucy?
Yes, I do. So the next poll question is, what testing and deployment issues do you have? Too many bugs in production, slow pages, server crashes, no formal testing. Okay, let's see what the results are. 1, 2, 3, closing poll. Too many bugs in production, 50%, and no formal testing, 79%. Wow, that's huge.
So maybe those two might be possibly related. You know, often the idea of testing is to catch the bugs before they get to production. So that is very interesting. Thank you, Lucy.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
So let me just throw in one other bonus issue here, which is risk reduction, which I noticed that only 5% of people say they do some kind of risk analysis. So risk analysis is looking at what things could go wrong and then coming up with a plan B or alternate mitigations that might deal with that risk. And that helps deal with having surprise issues come up that delay the project. You know, maybe the DBA isn't available at a key time, or maybe you thought you were going to get some realistic test data, but no one told the users that they had to prepare it. Maybe the users didn't understand that they were supposed to give all their feedback up front when you'd gone through the formal sign-off, but they didn't give all their real feedback until you actually delivered the app. Maybe you haven't kept track of what dependencies you have. So having a formal look at that and thinking through and brainstorming, and also regularly reviewing, you know, each month, okay, have any of these risks come up, or do we need to deal with them, or are they more likely, or are there any new risks, can help on that. So let me also share with you a survey that the Standish Group did a few years ago of project success factors, because I think this illuminates some of the keys here. They looked at major projects in Fortune 1000 companies and government organizations and education institutions. And here are the factors, and I know the type's kind of small. We will be sharing the PowerPoint as a PDF after the presentation, so you'll be able to expand this out. But just to read to you, the three top factors that take up 50% of project success factors are user involvement, executive management support, and clear statement of requirements. And that accounts for half of the success factors in successful projects, which is kind of mind-blowing, because the proper planning, good expectations, good milestones, competent staff, ownership, clear vision, and a hard-working, focused staff only accounted for the other 50% between those other 7 factors. So if you can get your users involved, senior management support, and have a clear statement of requirements, you're half the way there. So I found that a very interesting survey. So a lot of what we've talked about today are related to having good project management. And the idea of project management is to reduce the risks on your project, to make sure your client expectations are fulfilled, and that you get your project completed in budget and on time. And those are the goals we have at TerraTech. I hope you have similar goals where you're working, because good projects lead to happy developers, happy users, and hopefully more successful projects coming to you in the future. So that's why I think it's very important to look at these things, that often when we've got our heads down in the code or the database design, you know, it's easy to forget about these other factors. So that's what I hope has been helpful. So let me suggest some books, if you found this useful. You might look in more detail on these things. Some of these are classic books. Mythical Month was written in the late 60s. After an incredibly disastrous IBM project for the OS 360 development. And the title is this idea that senior management thinks if you add extra developers to a project, it actually makes it go faster. It's sort of like trying to add more women to a pregnancy to have it done in less than 9 months. It doesn't always work that way. And it expounds on that, and it's a great read. Another 2 books by Steve McConnell, who used to be a project manager at Microsoft and now has his own business, Rapid Development and Software Project Survival Guide, have a lot of tips in detail about how to have successful development, do good testing, and how to have teams work well. And then Peopleware by Tom DeMarco and Timothy Lister, which I mentioned earlier, is a great look at the political and sociological aspects of software development. But even today, I think this book is 15 or 20 years old, but so many people don't pay attention to these factors, and they can be the very things that trip up the project. You know, it's no good having your surgeon do an operation if the patient then dies on the table because the corporate politics didn't give them any oxygen during the operation. You know? And then the final one on here, which I found interesting, is another book by Tom DeMarco, and this time Barry Boehm, And that looks at some of the measurement and estimates and how you can use those to see how well you're doing. So not just making estimates of how long things are going to take and then comparing how long they actually took against the estimate, which I hope you're doing with your estimates, but also tracking how many bugs are being produced each month so you can see if that's going up or down. Maybe even tracking how many bugs were created, if you can figure this out, by each developer, so you can figure out which of the developers that write clean code and which write buggy code. How many bugs were found by each tester, so you know which testers are good at finding things. So there's all kinds of measurements that you can do on software projects to keep track of things. Maybe you also measure the complexity of the code. There are tools out there that will do that. Generally, complex code is not a good thing because it's hard to maintain. So that's the books there. So really what I'd like to, before we get to the Q&A, just say you've got a choice here. You can keep your eyes close to the code and ignore all this other stuff and take a risk that some of these factors are going to screw up the project no matter how good the work you did on a technical level is and end up with headaches. Or you can take account of these things as well as the technical factors and have project success. So what I'm curious about now is if you'd be interested in a project checkup from TerraTech. If you are, we have a poll on that. We do project...
Okay. Do you want me to go ahead and ask
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you bring up the poll, and let me just talk through the poll while you bring it up. So we can help out with reviewing the project to look for risk factors and how likely it is the project to fail and what can be done about it. Maybe you're interested in security issues or hacker protection. Perhaps you want your server optimized or code optimized and tuned, or perhaps you just want a code review and a second pair of eyes on it. So those are the different things, and let's just bring that up.
Okay, so here's the poll. I'm interested in the following TerraTech project checkups: project failure risk analysis, security and hacker proofing, server optimization and tuning, code review, or any others. I'll give you a few seconds. 1, 2, 3. Poll, share results. Okay.
So it looks like there's some interest in project risk analysis, so we'll be happy to help with that. And if you think of any other things afterwards, you're welcome to put them in the comments afterwards. So we're going to move to the Q&A now. Whoops.
Okay.
So if you want to put your questions into the question window, and why don't you read out the questions that we've received, Lucy?
Okay, so here's the first question. How do you make accurate estimates on ColdFusion projects? And then there's a note there that says, mine always seem to be way under.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is hard to write accurate estimates, so that is a great question. I think the keys to doing accurate estimates are making sure that you have split up the tasks into things you understand clearly and that none of them estimate out more than a few days of time. If you've got a task that's like going to be several weeks of time, see if you can split it up. And then having someone else review the estimate and look for missing tasks or things that aren't clear or perhaps things that are underestimated. And then also keeping track of your estimate against what actually happened in the project and then seeing which tasks you got accurately estimated and which ones are underestimated, which ones are over, so you can improve your estimating skill. So, because generally it takes experience to be able to write accurate estimates, and there are a lot of unknowns in there, so it is something that comes with experience, but there are definitely things you can do to improve your estimating skill. And then also I'd suggest having a look at the section on estimating in some of Steve McConnell's books, because he has a whole chapter dedicated to that. Will give you some ideas. So great question, thanks.
Okay. And then there's another question, or maybe it was more of a statement. It was during when you were talking about the planning. It does. How about no formal planning tools? Do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I mean, that can be an option if people don't use a formal tool for planning, then, you know, the advantage of using a formal tool is that it helps keep things organized and it'll help you think of things you hadn't thought of before. So certainly doing any planning is better than no planning at all. But if you don't have some kind of system you're following, it's easy to forget to do things on a particular project or not to write them down or not to share them with other people on the team. So I think having some kind of formal tool or system that you follow on every project is really helpful. And then obviously the more projects you use the tool on, the better you understand how you might improve the tool or the system and how you can make it better for future projects. So definitely is a good idea to have some planning tools.
Okay, and then another question here is, how do you keep code easy to maintain when on a deadline?
Oh my, well that is a tricky one there because it's hard enough to write code that's easy to maintain when you're not on a deadline. But when you've got a deadline, people often take shortcuts. So I think one of the things is to make clear that's a goal. That's the goal of the project, and then all the developers are clear on that. And then when you're doing code review, you know, one of the things you look at is, okay, if I was going to have to maintain this other person's code in the future, would I have any clue what is going on with it and how easy it would be to maintain? And what could we do to make it easier to maintain? Because generally code is not, you know, write once, read once. Generally code is written once or written a few times and then read many, many times. You know, if someone else is maintaining the code, you know, the project may have taken a few months to do, but it's maintained over 5 years. People are going to be reading that code a lot of times. And if it's hard to read, or if they read it and think it does one thing when it really does another, that's going to be a big issue. So making sure that you change your perspective and read the code as well as writing it. And you know, if you're a fan of extreme programming and pair programming, that's one way to achieve this, because one person could be writing while another person is kind of looking at the bigger picture, and part of that might be, is it easy to maintain, as well as looking at, is it fulfilling the requirements.
Okay, and then this is a two-part question. What's your view on coding frameworks? Do you like some over others?
So frameworks are a way of organizing your code so that it's easier to maintain. So kind of great lead-on question. So I definitely think it makes sense to use a framework. My personal view is using any framework is better than using no framework, because that way you have a standard way of doing things, particularly if you have a larger team where everyone needs to work on the code in a consistent manner. So, and then, you know, I have a personal like for Fusebox, but there are many other good frameworks out there. The reason I like Fusebox, apart from the fact I was involved in it, is that that's the one that's used by most organizations. So I think of framework use, about 50% use Fusebox, and then the next popular framework, which might be FW1 if I'm remembering from the State of the Union survey we did earlier in the year, was about 30%. So that's my view on frameworks. But really, it's, you know, I don't want to get into political debate about what frameworks is better than the other. You know, any framework is better than no framework. So go with one that you like. And also, some frameworks are better at certain kind of things. Some things are, you know, better at rapid prototyping of applications. Others are better at more complicated object models. So, you know, look at what you're trying to achieve, and also look at the skill set that the developers on your team have as well, and what the learning curve for the framework will be if they haven't used it before. Great.
Okay, and then I have a requirements question. The question is, what makes for good requirements?
Well, that's a great question, because, you know, when we were talking about scope creep, we said hey, having clear written requirements are important. I think the important thing is that they're requirements that are easy to read and understand. I've seen requirements documents that look like they were a phone book, and they thump down onto my desk, and it's like, oh my God, what has someone put in here? And then I'm trying to understand what the requirement meant. And it was hard for me to even understand what the requirement is. And then I'm thinking, okay, we're going to give this to some users and executives and expect them to sign off on this as though they understand what the system is going to look like. It would be crazy. So making sure that they're written clearly, definitely have some prototype or mock-up screens that you maybe put screen prints into the printed requirement, but you also have available that people can click through. And then I would include a vision statement at the front of it and some goals. So it's like an executive summary that says, here's what this project is all about, here's how we're going to know it's successful. If it's got these following goals achieved, then yeah, we're going to be happy with it. So those are things that I like to see in there. And then if you've got a good set of requirements, often it can be reused and turned into the test plan for the project. So you get double benefit from writing good requirements up front if you can.
Okay. And then I just have one more question. And the question is there a future for CF United?
Well, that's a good question. I've been looking at that myself and asking people. And, at the moment I don't think it's a hotel event that's going to happen just because of all the issues in doing large hotel events. But I am looking at doing an online event, which would be a lot less expensive for people to attend and a lot less expensive to run as well. So if any of you have any thoughts or suggestions on that, please email me at michael@teratech.com or fill something in a survey. I had a lot of fun and learned a lot of things at CF United over the 11 years that the event run in its different incarnations. I'd love to see some kind of version of that. But what I'm looking at right now is a virtual CF United. Any other questions before we close the webinar?
Yeah, we have a few more minutes, so maybe one more question. How do you test at a minimum?
So I'm not quite clear what that question means, and it's from Renee. Perhaps she would like to explain what she means by that, but let me talk while she thinks about it. So what's the minimum kind of testing I would do if I was short of time for testing? Well, I would want to simulate what a real user does on the application, and if possible, have them try out some of the tasks that they would normally use the application for and see how they did and what problems they ran into, because often I find developers have a very logical way of looking at things, which is great for writing code, but they don't take into account some of the crazy stuff users will get up to. So try out some simple test cases. And another technique that is often used is just pretend that you're a drunk monkey at the keyboard or the mouse and try out things that users wouldn't normally do, or options they're not supposed to do, or boundary conditions. If it says you're allowed to have up to 100 items in a thing, put 100 in, try and put 101 in, and see what happens. Try putting none in at all, see if the code deals with that. So those are things if you're testing at a minimum. And then I see, Renee, you had a related question about what we test applications with. Well, there are some automated test tools out there, and you can record scripts, and you can insert dummy data, and there are, as well as testing for application testing to see if there are bugs in there, there are also load testing tools that also let you put scripts in, and might, for example, let you load a whole spreadsheet full of 1,000 username and passwords for testing or other test data, and hammer away at the application to see if it can take the load of the user volume and that you're expecting it to. So a lot of different things out there, ranging in cost from free open source ones to thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars for some of the commercial applications. Any other questions we have before we wrap up? So it doesn't look like we have any other questions, unless you have any others there, Lucy?
No, no questions, yeah.
Okay. Well, I really want to thank everyone for attending. I appreciate you filling out the survey when the webinar exits to let us know what we did well and how we can improve. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please fill those in the comments, or if you have any suggestions for CF United, fill those in. And have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.